budget is. So the last 2 pages are a budget narrative and summary that you should take a look at. The second document you have with questions researched on the top is actually a document we provided for the project board, but item number 2 includes information about mediator certification for the courts here in Louisiana. And our one of our agenda items today is going to be mediator qualifications, so this is meant to help inform us.
Are you talking about community mediators here, or not? In other words, mediators for this kind of work?
No, this was really existing mediators.
Yeah, any kind of mediator. Okay.
Right, and what
because
they had
I think the first bullet isn't correct. Because there are state laws about civil and domestic mediators.
There are laws about if you're doing it through the court system,
Right.
and your court says that they prefer that you pick from the registered mediator list that the Bar Association provides.
No, excuse me, but there are actually laws on the books that say if you want to be a domestic mediator, this is the requirement, and then
Right.
Right, and
civil
then
mediator.
juvenile is different,
Or
with
juvenile,
custody
right.
and things like that.
So what do you mean by saying there's no Louisiana state
I
requirement?
was the one who put it together. So, it's okay. So, what I meant was that in general, for general mediation, if somebody said Lou wants to mediate this issue between you, Susan, and
Okay.
Lou, I don't need to, I can call myself a mediator without having any certification
Without calling yourself
requirements.
a domestic.
That's
or
right, that's the
civil
reason why I made distinctions later on for
So
civil
general,
cases
okay,
and child
got it.
custody and visitation cases. But that being the case, I will actually look for the other laws too and bring that in.
Okay, I mean, it doesn't really matter for the mediation we're talking about here,
It's relevant.
but I just didn't want to.
One last update, several of you agreed to be on the evaluation committee, which is our subcommittee that is going to talk about how we evaluate the mediation program and what the survey instruments are going to look like. My apologies to you, I was trying to pull together a meeting of that committee before Astrid left town, and I just didn't get around to it. So I'll be trying to schedule a meeting between us sometime in the next 14 days. Or 10 business days or whatever. So I will be contacting you soon about the evaluation committee. So this grant that I gave y'all a copy of, we actually submitted to the federal COPS program last Tuesday.
Yes.
If we got it, it would be $300,000 over 2 years, and we're doing it jointly with NOPD. So we'll let y'all know how that goes. But we are.
So go to your mosque in your church
And
and
pray. But there are others that we are applying for. I don't know if any of y'all have grant writing experience, but if you want to help with grants and don't want to be, you can either join the fundraising committee or you can contact me directly about helping draft grants.
Yeah, I've got to say, because we are really so under-resourced as an office, that we struggle so much with this, and we have really wonderful interns, who I want to introduce today at the table, but they're going to be leaving us. Many of them are going to be leaving us in July, and so then we're going to be back down to the bare bones for our community, for our group. So Jackie Aranda is from University of California, Berkeley, and is with us until the end of July. Super wonderful intern. We're very happy to have her. And Zoe Aiken is our excellent undergrad attorney who is, thank God, staying with us past August. We were very lucky also to have her. So I just wanted to acknowledge them at the table. People want to do the fundraising if they have experience, if they have any time to do that kind of stuff. We would really, 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 really appreciate it.
Can you run that, the fundraising, what about it?
If you have experience writing grants, or if you have time to write grants, we would really love if you could volunteer for that, because we're struggling putting that together.
I don't, but I know someone that does that might be willing to. Great.
Yeah, because we have a growing list of things to apply for, but limited resources to actually draft applications. The good news is, though, we have previous applications that people can work on.
Yeah, we have a lot of material we've already written up.
Good. Okay.
So I think with Eva's arrival, we have now gotten to a quorum. Because as of the loss of Dr. Cowan, we now need 9 votes to make a quorum. Is there anyone who didn't get to sign in? Pass this down. So everyone should have an agenda in front of them. Our pace is increasing because we want to finish this by the end of the year, so we all agreed to have more frequent, shorter meetings. And today, I truly believe that we can make all 4 of these decisions, 5 of these decisions. So the first one's a fairly simple one. And the question is, should police officers wear uniforms in the mediation? The arguments against them wearing a uniform is the power dynamic, right? The arguments for it are, if we want officers to be paid as police officers during these mediations, they have to be in uniform. There may be some exception we could negotiate with the chief, but under existing regulations, they would have to be in uniform. Also, the officer was in uniform during the interaction, right? So the argument is that power dynamic is there, and taking your uniform off doesn't make it go away. Well, first, let me open the floor for any arguments for or against uniforms.
I have a question then. If the officer would be in the mediation in uniform and on duty, should they receive a call to respond, would they then be leaving the mediation?
I think that we can arrange to let command desk know where they are and that they are not available to respond for that hour. But we do need to talk to the chief about that.
Because I would hate for them to be in the mediation, in their uniform, willing, good faith, all that kind of stuff, and then something happen and bam, there they go. Pretty sure the community member would understand, but
Okay, any other questions or concerns? So I think this is a fairly short decision. So if we can establish that the officer would be able to complete his mediation in uniform, how many people would be willing to let the officers come in uniform? Are there any folks unwilling? Can I hear from you two about what you're thinking?
I don't know that I would block a decision that was being made. I don't know that it's that serious, but I don't know, it just seemed obvious to me that the police officer shouldn't wear a uniform, and it is, just a much more level playing field, and I think it serves the officer well, because I think it humanizes the officer too.
What about you?
Yeah, I have a similar thought. I mean, it seems good to the extent that you can have people interacting as to human beings rather than bringing their situational personas from outside the room. To have people be able to see each other as on a level as just two people talking about something. And I know personally I'm intimidated by police officers in uniform. And I think I would have an easier time expressing myself if I were talking to somebody who weren't bringing all those trappings that have so much, significant meaning in this society. Calls up a lot of things.
Simon, and then Lou.
Even though it is 2 people, but it is a citizen and an officer that is the encounter. The key to address your concerns is the mechanisms that are put in place and how parties have to behave in that environment. And the facilitator, picking up on cues of uneasiness from one person to the next person and kind of dealing with that on some level. For those individuals who would have a problem with the officer being in uniform, I would agree, I think, in general, it probably would put a person more at ease on some level to not see the officer in uniform for whatever the issues might be with the uniform. But I think the breakthrough, if there is one, and the benefit is that the officer is in uniform, in that position, viewing him or her how you saw him out on the scene. And I think if there's a breakthrough, it's a bigger breakthrough, it's a better breakthrough with the officer being in uniform. I just think that's a better approach. Not being in uniform, and while we do some things depending on one's assignment, officers, depending on one's assignment, not in uniform, but in general, most officers, the majority do work in uniform. If they go to court, they're going to be in uniform. If they go to many other things, they're going to be in uniform. Even when they grilled on the stand, of course, they're in uniform. And so if somebody's saying, look, I'm not happy with this or with that, they're typically going to be in uniform. My day-to-day assignment, I do investigations on administrative violation of officers. And they're in uniform when I do those. So I think if the officer comes to some realization that he or she could have done something better, differently, I just think it's more powerful if they're in uniform and come to that same realization with the power that you're speaking of and say, oh, you know what, wow, I really could have done something different. Also, if you're in regular civilian clothes, while the communication might be a little bit different, a lot of times officers do put themselves, you know what, once I put the uniform down, I'm a different person. You know, unless I'm coming to do a police function. I'm a different person, you know, I just deal with things a whole lot different. I just have a different personality. But when I put the uniform on, I may be a certain way. And the things that you say to me and how I might behave when I'm not the police, I might not deal with that situation as Joe Blow, the citizen. But as an officer, I believe based upon what happened, what I observed, I need to be a certain way. So getting me to see that while I'm in this mind frame is just a plus, I think.
Lou and Susan.
Yeah, initially when I was thinking of this, I thought, well, no, obviously not a uniform because of all the things we've talked about. But in thinking about it, we really are talking about building trust between the community and the police, not between one person and another person, just two individuals, but the institution of the police. And so dealing with, if I'm a community person and I see somebody on the street in a uniform, and I've had an experience with them in uniform in mediation that was a satisfactory one, I will see that person in uniform and globalize it and say, well, you know, he's probably as good guy as the guy in that there. So there's, you know, we're dealing with institutions, and that's, and we can't get around that. So that's why I'm very uniform.
Susan, then Ethan.
I think they have to be in uniform because that's what we're doing. We're mediating between civilians and police officers. That's all I have to say.
I just wanted to say, I agree with Lou that it's very important in the trust building process. In my work with Hispanic Outreach with Officer Jansen Valencia, we often went and gave talks about crime prevention to different churches. And when I first started doing the outreach to the pastors requested that he go in plain clothes. But Officer Valencia couldn't do it because it was on the job. So, you know, I insisted, and I also felt at that time that they had to get used to that uniform. You know, it's a different scenario, but it still goes to the trust building process. I think it's very important.
Can people also just announce who they are, so that our interns are able to actually get down?
Oh, I'm sorry, because I didn't do introductions at the beginning, so yeah, they don't, y'all met them, but they haven't met you. Do y'all want to briefly just go around the table and let them know who you are? We all know each other, but Lou, what you tell me?
Community Mediation Services.
Wes Ware with Breakout.
I'm Abby Breakout with OPD until the end of this week.
I'm Allison Curry, actually community member?
Eva Hurst, another community member.
Simon Hog Road, Black Organization of Police.
Susan Norwood, Community Mediation.
Mary Ellen Stitt.
Thank you for doing
Thanks.
that.
What's her name?
Mary Ellen Stitt.
Marion.
I want to just address one concern. For some people, I'm sure the officer being in uniform is more challenging than others. I would say our process is important to that. That may be a basic question to ask. Not giving them the impression that the officer won't be in uniform if that's not the way we go. But knowing that the facilitator can deal with that on some level. To squelch as best as he or she can the person's concern about the uniform. It might have to be some kind of conversation about whatever the previous issues were before the person comes to the mediation, so that they are more receptive of the fact that that person is going to be in uniform. That may be an issue.
Can I also just mention too, I think it's San Francisco,
I'm not sure why New York though.
I spoke to a number of the programs across the country, and I know that all the programs have officers that are in uniform during the mediation, but I think it was San Francisco that also said that they highly encourage their officers to not come in uniform. So that, I just wanna leave that alternative open, that there's three alternatives: they come in uniform, they don't come in uniform, or, you know, they can come in uniform if they want, but that the mediation program or coordinator, whoever sets it up, highly encourages them not to.
So to recap right now, the dynamics that we're weighing are, on one hand, we want to even the power differential and reduce intimidation from the uniform. On the other hand, we have the argument that the uniform is part of what we're trying to do, and that the facilitator and ground rules can address power dynamics. So, having had this discussion, has anyone changed position? Okay, so then,
I wonder whether we could build this into the evaluation. I mean, maybe if we started out with people in uniforms, that could be something that we ask
Ask an
people about
evaluation
afterwards
question.
and kind of reassess down the line. I know the project I studied in Brazil did that, and they actually started out with people in uniform and decided after about a year of the program to have people not come in uniform. But I mean, it might just be something we could see how it goes. And
I think that's a great idea.
okay, so right now we have an alternate proposal that we start off with letting them use uniforms, build that into the evaluation, and assess in a year. Is there anyone who objects to that proposal? Okay, so that's what we're gonna go with. All right.
The fastest decision we've ever made.
Right.
We did pretty good last week, right?
Yeah.
Whatever.
So moving on. So the next question is, when the mediator is arranging the mediation, what are the incentives we offer officers for successful mediation? So the ones provided by Astrid, I'm gonna just go over real quick. Content is confidential. Content cannot be used in any future judicial proceedings. The allegation is removed from officer's record and replaced with mediated with no further investigation. The case cannot be appealed. A copy of the mediation agreement is placed in the PIB file and not circulated further. A letter of recognition to the police officer's supervisor that a successful mediation has occurred. And of course, we can add or subtract other options. So before we begin the discussion, I would just like to flag that the first three things have already been kind of discussed and agreed upon by this group. We've all agreed that everything's confidential, and that when the person agrees to mediate, they agree to not pursue any court remedies or formal investigation. So these other things are ways that might encourage an officer to want to participate in mediation. And I'm thinking about how to facilitate this discussion. Let's start by saying, is there anything on this list that people believe should not be there?
Of the three,
That can answer the question.
Wait, I saw 3 hands, so let me do West and Allison and then.
I just actually had a question. The case cannot be appealed. What do we do with that?
So typically, if an officer goes through a formal investigation, he has the right to appeal any decision.
To the Civil Service Board, where frankly, a lot of cases where discipline has been imposed, the Civil Service Board has listened to those appeals and granted them, so that the officer will get his or her job back, or the sanction will be removed, so it's a pretty powerful.
And the alternative to that is that the complainant couldn't say, I'm not satisfied with the mediation, so I want you to investigate.
And the woman who is, I don't actually remember her project, I'm sorry, her title, but Lisa Hudson, who's in charge of the Civil Service Board, was with us for one of our meetings here at the mediation. 3 months ago. How was it?
My question was on the middle one. The copy of the mediation agreement is placed and the file can't be circulated any further. Can we say that? I mean, are we allowed to say that no, it does not leave this file? The police officer's file can never be subpoenaed, it can never go, I mean, nothing in there could ever go any further?
Well, we can make our own rules, but a subpoena would be
Right.
decided by a judge,
Right.
right? So we could make our own internal rules that this is not subject to public records request. And if somebody wanted to litigate that issue, they could.
Okay.
But
I think that it would be hard to actually shield it from a public records request. However, Civil Service has said that they don't necessarily need it in their files, and that they're not taking a position on that issue. And so, we're making recommendations here, and then they're going up to the chief, Susan Hudson and Calvin Johnson, and they're giving wide berth for our decisions. So,
Yeah, my only concern is that we would say, and our program would say that it would remain, and that someone above and or outside of the program would come in and say, no, too bad, and that sort of puts mud on our face. And just deletes any trust that we've built.
I mean, another option is that there can be a mediation agreement that doesn't go in anyone's file, right? That's copies are given to the 2 participants, and that's it.
I mean, or you just at the outset, say that to the participants. I mean, a lot of people will say to clients with their mental health or medical records that these are confidential, but not if they're subpoenaed or we request them or sort of things like that. There's always going to be exceptions to the rule, and I just think at the beginning that's outlined to both the participants that if they agree to it, then they agree to it, but just let them know,
the mediation agreement going in the officer's file, there's a question as to what is that document gonna look like? Because it really whatever it contains really may not be that significant. That a mediation took place related to a complaint by Mr. Smith and was mediated. I mean, I don't really know if that's necessarily anything bad. I mean, so if people got that doesn't really do anything necessarily.
Well, the agreement is between the 2 people,
No,
so they would decide what goes into it,
what would go on the document itself?
the agreement, that's correct.
Okay, that could be an issue. But what I'm saying is,
I mean, there can also be a form,
If-
which is the mediation.
Right.
We've agreed to actually have a mediation as well.
So that would be the agreement to mediate.
Right. And we've gotten a lot of these papers, I've given a lot of these papers to folks as we've done meetings all along. They're pretty basic. The mediation agreement can be a lot more creative. It can be, the one we always like to use is the individual police officer that goes to the complainant's church for, 4 Sundays in a row to see that that individual has standing in the community. So it can be as creative as that, or we also haven't really even agreed whether there should be a mediation agreement, or there always is
first decision about officer uniforms. Oh, do you have any more papers for that?
Yes, they're right here.
Here, I have extra. Here you go.
Thank you so much.
Can you just hand them down all the people? Thanks.
So the basic decision was we're gonna have officers wear uniforms, make that part of our evaluation and reassess in a year. Now we're talking about officer incentives, and the discussion is about the item on the back of the page, the mediation agreement going into the PIB file. And Mariella, you have something to say?
Oh, I just liked the idea that you raised, which is that if both parties are informed that, you know, this could be subpoenaed or whatever, then they could make a decision about whether they wanna just leave with their copies and not have anything go into the file, or whether they would feel better if something did go into the file, knowing that it could be subpoenaed and continue in business. So we got it to them.
Point of clarification on what was said. If they're just two documents, am I understanding that would be the only copies of the two documents, and a decision would be made by the parties whether it went in the officer's file? Is that what I'm understanding?
So you want, this would actually say a copy of the mediation agreement may be placed in the
And the officer and or the citizen would make that determination? Is that what we?
But they'd have to come to a consensus that we want this document to also go in the officer's file. And honestly, I don't see mediation agreements coming out of every mediation, right? I see that being more rare. But in the event that during that mediation, the complainant and the officer agreed to some sort of solution, they can decide, we want this solution noted in the officer's record or not. And typically, I'm guessing if it's a good solution, the officer would want it in his file, and because they came to that agreement together, the complainant would be fine with that.
Just for clarification of clarification, if there's a mediation, something that says there was a mediation will exist somewhere in some file someplace.
Oh, yes, let me be clear. So Chief Westbrook made it clear to us she needs some sort of document. So there is an agreement to mediate that will go into the file. If not our files, well, definitely our files, but maybe the PIB file too.
So there'll be a history of mediations.
Yeah, there'll be something that says this issue got mediated so that because PIB needs some sort of document to close their case, right? So it definitely would go into PIB if this particular case number is being mediated.
But not necessarily on the officer's disciplinary file.
Just that, should we want to have a track of how many mediations were held, et cetera, et cetera.
Right, and I think PIB has been very clear that they want to be able to note that. So we haven't agreed to that, but PIB has made it clear to us that they want to be able to have some sort of history on that officer and the number of mediations he's had.
As I'm looking at this, and this kind of goes to the next one. If there's an agreement based upon how simple, how complex it might be, and that goes into a file. But when there isn't an agreement, regardless of whether there should have been one, if people looking at it objectively say, look, that seems like something they could have agreed on, and it just doesn't happen, and it doesn't go in the file.
Does that reflect negatively?
Right. As you move forward and you have more agreements, and the ones that didn't occur, that might not necessarily be the officer's fault, but how is that necessarily going to be looked at? If someone goes to look at, this person has had some complaints, but they've had several successful ones, this person hasn't, why? And let's say two people up for promotion by some chance, and let's say someone takes a look at that. You're not necessarily going to know why those weren't successful. And let's say each one only had two. Make it a small number, and hopefully it's less than that, but let's say it's two. One person had two successful, one person had two unsuccessful for whatever reason. Person's probably going to look at the unsuccessful as being negative for some reason. So I have some concerns about that.
Well, let me clarify one thing. The mediation agreement doesn't determine the success of the mediation. and we need to be clear about this in our program materials and description to the department. The mediation agreement happens if people want to make an agreement.
So when we say agreement, we just mean get together to have the mediation? Is,
No, let's say you and I mediate, right? You pulled me over and I felt like you were rude to me.
right.
And as a solution to that, I was like, you know what, I would really like for you to come to my child's school and talk to them about traffic safety. Right? And so we agree to that. And that's our mediation agreement. Or we have our mediation and we leave it me saying, you know what, you were doing your job. Maybe next time you could be a little nicer to people. And that's it. And we don't write that down. Both of those are successful mediations. It's just one of them decided that they wanted a next step.
And the board feels very strongly about that. That was a decision that took them a while to actually decide, and came out of a discussion of the general principles, but they felt strongly that successful mediation can be with or without a formal agreement.
Susan, I know you agree.
That's exactly what I was gonna say. I mean, that's true of all mediation, not just this kind of thing.
I'm just trying to figure out, we say a copy of the mediation agreement. So if they agree to do something or
To
whatever
write
that,
it down, that's what it means, to write something down.
that's the document that's gonna go in there.
Right. And it should only be a positive document, right? Because it should only involve both people agreeing to take positive next steps.
Okay. And then a letter of recognition to the police officer supervisor that a successful mediation occurred. Like I say, those things are kind of related, because if there's an unsuccessful one,
Then it's
and
going
the
back to
supervisor is
investigation.
aware that I went to a mediation, and they don't receive a letter, then they know the mediation wasn't successful. But why wasn't it successful? If they're aware of what the previous, let's say the complaint was, how is that gonna be viewed going forward? So I'm not really sure about the supervisor being made aware that the mediation was unsuccessful, unless, if that's gonna be a part of it, seem like on some level, it needs to be addressed why. One, maybe not saying who, but one party was not willing to continue or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I think we had talked about the mediator having to make some record if people didn't participate in good faith.
There is a natural, usually in process, there is a natural record, whether or not it's a positive, a successful or unsuccessful mediation, whatever, you just know parties refuse to sit down, but, whatever, just a brief note, and I think what you're saying, that letter can actually include all that, whatever the reason is.
Well, I'm not sure why the officer supervisor needs to be made aware of that. That's where I'm actually going. I'm not sure what's the purpose of that.
We put that down as something that the officer might want to happen. So these are all incentives, right? We assume that an officer would like to have a positive letter sent to a supervisor, but this might not be an effective incentive, I don't know.
But one last caveat to that, what you're saying is like, what if, it still shows a good faith on the side of the police officer if the police officer was willing to sit down and mediate, and it's the person, whatever other reason, so that resolves in unsuccessful mediation. I think it still looks as a positive on the police officer side, and it says, okay, I showed up, I was ready to play ball, but, so it could be viewed.
Are supervisors made aware of officers' complaints? I mean, if there's a complaint against an officer that's in your unit?
There's apparently an underlying presumption that an officer supervisor, and usually, by the way, there's several. In a district environment, the officer usually has anywhere from 1 to 3 sergeants and a lieutenant as immediate supervisors, and then of course a commander above that. But they generally may or may not be in any way participating in any disciplinary action. If it comes through public integrity handles it. Supervisor really has nothing to do with it whatsoever. They may not even be aware there is a complaint.
Okay, that's what I was
So,
getting
no,
to.
they're not necessarily integral to the system, and really aren't participatory unless they're the ones initiating the complaint themselves, or it comes through them. If it goes through PIB, they wouldn't have any interaction.
Yeah, we inadvertently missed one option here as far as an incentive. Another incentive that should be mentioned is that nothing is placed on the disciplinary record, so that not even that there was a mediation be placed on
Yeah,
the
there's an
disciplinary
allegation
record.
and the whole.
so that looking at the disciplinary record, he wouldn't even know that there was anything mediated at all. That also should be listed as an option for officer incentive.
So it sounds to me like the officers are suggesting that the letter to the supervisor is not really an incentive. Is there any objection to removing that from the list?
Doesn't seem relevant if they don't know of a complaint.
Eva, then you.
I was just gonna say, maybe do a letter of recognition to the PIB, to the file itself, the mediation file,
Okay.
in case, at least it's documented somewhere, and have, the police officer could have a choice of doing it, instead of a supervisor, just for it to go into the record.
And something that I'll just remind people of too, is if the mediation program does remain within the police monitor's office, we are a city office, and so any paperwork which is in the file, once the mediation case is closed, is open for public records requests. So that means that somebody, a news reporter, for example, can just simply make the request to our office, and we have to turn that over unless we think that it's privileged information, which this would not be.
Abby and Susan.
And could that request be, I'd like to see all the mediations that were held this year?
Yes.
I'm a little confused. Will it be like numeric, like statistic, or of the actual
Well,
you
keep
know,
in mind, the only
agreements?
documents we would have are the entrance and exit survey, the
Okay.
agreement to mediate, and possibly a mediation agreement.
Right.
Well,
There's
that's
not
my,
It would have names on it.
yeah, it would have names, and technically, that, especially that.
No, if
section of
you
this
make a
document.
complaint to our office, your name is not protected unless you ask to be.
Well, I mean, the contract, the agreement, sorry.
The agreement?
The agreement within itself, which is, was kind of like a view into the mediation, in a sense, the mediation session. So that's kind of like protected within the confidentiality. So where that, in my opinion, that wouldn't go in technically.
The agreement is not going into the record,
No.
correct?
We haven't made that decision.
Okay.
Any
Is it my
paperwork
turn
would
now?
be open to public records request, including the mediation agreement.
No, well,
There's
the
a statute
mediation
that says it's
agreement
confidential.
should not be in the record.
Okay.
I mean, the agreement to mediate could be in the record, but the mediation agreement has to belong to the parties.
Right, and the parties, according to our discussion, could decide that they wanted to place it into the record.
Well, they
Into
have-
that, yes,
Right.
that's right, that's what this one is about, but it wouldn't be automatically in your file.
Right, but if it was in our file, it would be.
Usually a copy of the agreement is also recorded. And so the parties walk away with the agreement, obviously, but then a copy of the agreement is usually filed because, whatever.
But they wouldn't wanna do that because it would be
It
part of
wasn't
Right,
involved, so
that's-
they'd have to walk away. So I'm thinking a way of like protection for both parties. Because we walk away with agreement, but if things get lost, how you like still keep the integrity of that. That's what I'm questioning.
As it sits right now, what, my understanding then of what would be available if a public records request were sent for, let's say, a mediation that occurred, would be the agreement to mediate, which includes the community member and the police officer's name, time and place or whatever of mediation,
and
that's
the
it.
mediator.
And yeah,
And who the mediator is.
Yeah.
And then, if they choose to put something else in the file, the parties choose to put something else in the file that contains their personal and confidential information and their personal and confidential mediation session, if that gets made public, where then does that put the mediator? You know what I mean?
It's okay with
Would the
the mediator,
mediator be,
it's their
but I mean, if
information.
something would go to court or something like that, it wouldn't be a
It's
problem.
it's
It's their information, okay.
The judge may be
And-
entertaining, confidential.
But
And
it's
also
not
the
gonna go
exit
through the
survey.
church. Yes,
It wouldn't.
sir.
And the exit survey, oftentimes, people are given the option of including their names or not. So they're not given the option of saying whether they're police officer or complainant.
Right.
But, and I'm just saying from what other programs do, but they are given the option of including their names.
Okay.
Abby, did you have your hand up?
It took me a second to remember what it is that I wanted to say. I was just gonna say, why not let the officer decide if they want the letter to be sent to the supervisor? Cause I think that sort of positive reinforcement is really good, especially since publicly, I think the police force gets a lot of negative reinforcement. So to have like your gold star or like picture on the fridge might feel good for them. So let them decide if they wanna do it or not.
Okay, so as it stands, it sounds like everyone agrees content will be confidential. Everyone agrees content cannot be used in any future judicial proceedings or be subject to public discovery.
Couldn't have it, the way the statute is around mediation, you can't, that's, wouldn't be a thing, but that's a good thing.
Okay, and I think we agreed that the case cannot be appealed. Okay. So where we are left is, officer has the option to put mediation agreement in the file.
The agreement to mediate or the mediation?
Mediation agreement. Officer has the option of having a letter sent to supervisor. The entire allegation is removed from the disciplinary record. Or the allegation is removed and replaced with mediated in their disciplinary record. Right, so let's weigh removing the entire thing versus removing it and replacing it with mediated. Where do people fall on that?
So if somebody had an allegation on their record and then it went through the usual investigation and it was found to be unsubstantiated, would it be totally removed? There would
No.
be no record that was ever.
It's on there, but what is placed on there is whether the three options are substantiated, unsubstantiated, or exonerated.
Because to me, it would make sense to do that same thing except say mediated instead of one of those three things, just for what we spoke about a couple of weeks ago, in which we said that it would be somewhat up to the PIB's discretion to say, oh, this person has had a string of the same allegations, so maybe we should think about doing something other than mediation this time, and if there's no record of that, then they wouldn't be able to make that judgment call.
I hear that. And just as an aside, I think that's where Arlinda would fall. And not
Chief
having,
Westbrook in charge of PIB.
sorry. I think she would rather have a record of some sort. But this is our program, right? So if we think that it will get more officers involved for there to not be a record, then we can make that suggestion as well.
I have a question then to the officers. Would it be better as an officer to have it just go away or to have it mediated? Which is a bigger incentive for the officer to,
Going away is always a better incentive.
going away is always better.
Any other thoughts?
Even if it's a positive.
Yes, even if it's a positive. The only thing that's positive about it is that you participated in a mediation.
Right,
It wasn't
right.
positive that you got the complaint to begin with.
Exactly.
And the problem is, you could have a dozen complaints, all of which are exonerated, but they're still in your record, and invariably, they come back to haunt you at some point with someone say, aha, look how many complaints you have, whether they're legitimate or not, they're in there. And it's just one more thing that ends up on there.
And apropos of that point, at this point, what PIB does is if you have 3 or more complaints within a 6-month period, then you go to PEP, which is the school to sort of retrain officers of the need the department has determined for more re-education.
And yet it still, even if it were removed, it still would be invisible because someone would know that this officer had a number of mediations.
Well,
If one-
what we're
one
weighing
sought
right
to
now
find
is that
out.
there's nothing there at all versus there's something that says it was mediated.
And one of the options also can be that there's something that says that it's mediated, but that it doesn't count toward the officer going to PEP, or it doesn't go toward any kind of decisions on promotion or anything like that.
Okay, I just want to take a step back from, I think last meeting we discussed about, number of complaints and that sort of thing or whatever. So PIB is actually going to be giving the complaints to this program. So they will have already decided whether they will or will not investigate it. And it would probably fall then into one of their unsubstantiated or unsubstantiatable because it's a he said, she said. So it would go into the officer's file that way, correct? If it's not,
We decided that we wanted that process and we would go to PIB to see if they would do it that way.
Right, but if we decided that PIB would be making the decision on which cases they're gonna investigate, which cases they're gonna offer mediation.
We decided that was the process.
Okay.
so if that's the case, they're gonna give us the D line or whatever it is, you know, complaints, basically the he said, she said kind. So the incentive, I mean, really for the officer to participate in the mediation as opposed to not participate, because if they choose not to participate, it says unsubstantiated and nothing happens.
Right.
So if there's nothing there at all, that's the incentive for the officer to say, hey, I am gonna go to this mediation, because if there's, and like you just said, if even 5 unsubstantiated complaints are in your file, it still comes back to bite you in the butt at some point. And if the incentive for the officer is that it's gonna be gone and not there, and there is a record of it, there's an exit interview, there's, you know, that kind of thing, that, in my opinion, I think it should just be gone.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Is,
I think it's a great incentive.
is it something that the PIB would consider having it vanish? Who holds that authority, or is it something?
Well, ultimately,
to
the authority is in the project board, right? So that's the chief of police,
Okay.
the head of our office, and Judge Johnson.
But I can
So let's
tell you
work it.
that the board very much cares what this group's opinion
Sure.
is.
Let's work it fair and right is right. In terms of like the general public, the average public in the community, if you're arrested, you have the option of expungement of sealment. You know, whether or not the arrest is substantiated. And there's countless people out there with arrests who, you know, falsely arrest, however that arrest record remains. And they have the option of expunging or seal.
Not
So,
always.
not always,
Really,
but depends on you get one shot, and it also depends on the charge. So, with that consideration, would it be something that the IB board would consider if the parties agree that it can go up, both officer and whoever makes the claim, agreed, okay, it's resolved, and, if the IB decides they'll
Well, I think
make
that
it disappear or something.
the incentive for the citizen is that their complaint is actually going somewhere. And PIB is not just saying, oh, it's unsubstantiated, so there's nothing we can do about it, and we can't investigate it, he said, she said. But you can go to this mediation thing. And so the incentive for the citizen is to be heard, first of all. And the incentive then for the officer, there isn't one if the complaint's still gonna be there, because he's gonna say, well, really, why would I even do that when it's gonna say unsubstantiated on my thing anyway?
What I'm saying, would the PIB consider expunging, quote unquote, so to speak, that if it's a successful mediation and both parties agree? That's my question.
I think if that's the recommendation of this committee, the PIB will have to consider it, because that's the recommendation of this committee. I will, 2 caveats. We cannot use the word expunge. There were laws passed in the 90s that made it very explicit that officer records could not be expunged, right?
I mean, the complaint.
Yeah, officer complaint records could not be expunged. But second of all, I'm a little uncomfortable with the criminal law comparison, because these officers still have rights as citizens, and if they were charged as a citizen, they'd be in the same position as a citizen ostensibly. But what we're talking about is their rights to their job.
Labor.
Right, which is a different issue, right? And so you don't have the same rights as a New Orleans police officer as you do as a private U.S. citizen. And I'm just a little uncomfortable with that comparison as far as the expungement thing goes, right?
There's also a point.
It was a rough comparison, but however, if you look it up, an expungement is done for those who want to pursue employment, other major life activities in which this arrest has created an interruption. So really, it's not too far away.
No,
But I see what you.
I get what you're saying, but I think the difference there is that that officer could, in theory, if he loses his right to be a New Orleans police officer, go get another job, right? Whereas the citizen who's been convicted of a felony really,
Not even a conviction.
you know what I'm saying? Like,
Arrest. I'm not talking.
Yeah, but anyway,
Just on,
He's talking
because I'm
arrest
still
now.
a little confused, as usual. The PIB board has a record that this officer has gone to mediation. Because we've said that, right? So, by not having this record on this file, which file are we talking about as, since the PIB has a record that that complaint went to mediation?
I can only answer what other programs have done across the country, so, other programs have the actual disciplinary file, which certain people can look up in internal affairs, and usually our counterpart, the civilian organization that works with the police department, monitors the police department. So that database is their record, and then there's internal records also that are either internal affairs records that are mediation records and are only mediation records, or the records that are kept by the mediation program itself. So they're not officer specific, they're mediation specific. And what we have here in New Orleans is something called IAPRO, which is an internal database, and that records the police officer's disciplinary file. So it wouldn't, if we chose that option, it wouldn't go into IAPRO. So that means that when I'm back at the office and I'm writing up a complaint that PIB is gonna investigate, what I do is I look up how many complaints an officer has. I wouldn't be able to tally that up. I don't know if that makes it clear. The other thing I was gonna mention is that I do believe that this is one of the decisions that the board asked this body to have a supermajority on. They felt it was important that there be as close to consensus as possible.
Eva, Captain Glass.
Was it clear to everybody that she just explained, or am I?
No, your questions are good, I have a comment on it too.
I just,
I'm still confused.
y'all wanna clarify that first? Cause I'm gonna go on something.
Generally speaking, when a complaints come in from a variety of sources. Sometimes they go directly to the IPM, and then the IPM will send it to PIB. Sometimes they go right to PIB, and sometimes they come in through a supervisor on the street. But eventually, all roads lead back to PIB. They're the brokerage for all internal investigations. They generally take anywhere from a day to 14 days to determine what they're gonna do with a complaint that comes in. Whether it has merit and it should be investigated, or it does not. I would presume that 14-day window is when they would decide when something is going to be subject to mediation or not. So PIB will have that complaint. Whether it ends up in an officer's jacket will be determined if it's mediation. If it's mediation, it doesn't go in the jacket. If it's investigated, it does. There's really only one file to deal with. So it's gonna be up to PIB to determine in that 14-day window what they're gonna do with it. Same as they always do. They determine right from the beginning whether something is what we call a DI-1, which is a formal investigation, or a DI-2 or a DI-3, which are less formal issues. So they have the same 14-day window to determine that. And once they do that, if it's in the file, it's indelible, it doesn't come out. And if it's mediation, it doesn't have to go in to begin with. So I don't know if that helps a little bit.
So there would be no actual file other than our internal
Correct.
existence that there were mediations, and we wouldn't know who the mediations were between.
No, we would know who the mediations were between, but it wouldn't be on a separate list going by officer. It would be, there was a mediation that occurred on this date, and on this date, mediation was between this officer and this component.
It looks like it resolved the earlier problem because then it doesn't even make it to the level of a complaint, right?
Correct.
So-
That's correct.
Okay, Eva, Captain.
So, I just want to go back to the PEP class. So you said that after 3 complaints,
I think
they,
that's a calendar year though, not 6 months.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I misspoke.
3 complaints, then they go to PEP class.
Yes.
And then, I think you mentioned something about, there's an incentive that they wouldn't, if there was a positive outcome, they wouldn't have to go to the PEP class or something?
I mentioned
something like
that there's one of our possibilities should be or could be that, it would be mentioned mentioned on the officer's disciplinary file that something was mediated, however, that mediated case would not count as one of the 3 complaints within a 12-month period that would cause an officer to go.
I think that's a good incentive, because I do the Latino cultural awareness presentation when officers are in for the PEP classes, and they hate the PEP classes. They hate being there. So I think that'd be a good incentive.
The issue of the mediated complaints technically disappearing is a great incentive for a couple of reasons. One, having not sustained on one's record that's available, and having mediated while one was investigated and one was mediated, someone might look at those as being the same on some level. The incentive, and plus it's about incentives for the officer, we'll come to the citizen in a minute, that's one. Okay, you know what? I'll go and this complaint won't be on my record. From the citizen, for them to face the officer that they had that encounter with is a very big incentive. So as we sit here on one level, we might say, you know what, but we're looking for a lot of incentives for the officer and not as many maybe for the citizen, but that should be that way. Because the idea is getting the officer willing to come in a positive sense and participate in something that he or she doesn't normally participate in, is going to, has already been accused of not doing something properly in some fashion, and is now going to hit this person in some fashion saying, look, you didn't do this right, or you could have did this, or whatever the case is. And knowing I'm going to get that as compared to PIB, one of the captains, coming and asking questions about something they did, which is a much different environment. So the incentive has to be fairly big to get the person to want to go and face that other environment, I think.
What does the board think about the incentives in terms of police officers, drawing them in?
Process-wise, we have to bring our decision to them and then deal with it.
But I don't think that they've actually spoken on this issue. I mean, they've certainly felt strongly that there needs to be officer incentive. But that's as far as we really got it. I mean, the reason why these issues have been touched upon by the board before they come to us is because we all agreed here, this planning committee, to the general principles, and the general principles touch upon some of these issues. One of them being that there needs to be officer incentive. So they agreed to that there needs to be officer incentive, but I believe, unless Ursula with a much stronger memory disagrees with me, I don't believe that they've actually touched upon what specifically would be the officer incentive.
You know, when we meet with them this Thursday, provided we make a decision today, that's when we'll hear what they think about our decision. And if for some reason the board is uncomfortable with one of our decisions, then I just bring that back to the group and we talk about it. Does that make sense?
Can you go through it? Yes.
Okay, so I'm gonna hear from Mary Ellen and Wes, and then I'm gonna suggest we take a vote.
I just wanted to back up a little and raise the question. I mean, first, I want us to consider that there might actually be some natural incentives for the officers to participate, and I say that only because the project that I was looking at in Brazil just did what we first named, which was put mediated in the record, and they don't have any problem at all getting officers to participate. Because I think they find that officers also are interested in sitting down with people and having a chance to kind of justify their actions or to talk that out. And then I also just wanted to raise the question whether if we do think that there have to be more incentives in this, whether there would be any positive incentives, like you get like merit points, or we somehow make it part of the police culture that it's considered a really positive thing if you went to mediation, because it shows that you're really interested in making relationships better with the community, or I guess I'm just wondering, because whether there are other options that we're not considering that might still allow us to keep a better record of allegations, because it does make me kind of nervous for the PIB not to know that there have been a string of similar allegations.
And I'll also just say that every program across the United States has really used different officer incentives. I gave folks a list a while ago. And each one of them, the mediation program has been a very big success. As far as both officers and complainants coming back with very positive responses on it.